So Joe Warner is up next to tell you about a project that he's working on to modernize an IBM BPM application.
Hi everybody. For those that aren't sure, my name up here is Alistair Warner. That's my formal name. Joe's my nickname. That's how everybody knows me really. I think, as David has already said, application modernization means many different things to many different people. A lot of the talks that you're going to hear today are about the sexy, glamorous end of application modernization. What you're going to hear from me is at the opposite end of the spectrum. It's pretty mundane and not so glamorous, but still very necessary. So I'm going to talk about our experiences working with one specific customer. I think, as you'll come to see, they're starting from a very low base. And so there were lots and lots of opportunity for things that we could modernize. And that's good because that's what we're here to talk about today. Obviously, for those of you that know BP3, then you'll know that our heritage is with the IBM BPM or Lombardi product as it was. And that's really what we're going to be looking at here and now. Okay, let's take the first slide. So we were introduced to a customer who had a solution that was originally built some 8 or 10 years ago. And they were looking, they had a third party that had been maintaining that solution for them, but for various reasons they wanted to move on, and so became a customer for BP3. The software, say, was written 8 or 10 years, or the solution was developed 8 or 10 years ago, and the software that the platform that it runs on really hasn't been modernized in all that time. So most of us were very surprised to find that we're working with a version of software that was as old as it was. We haven't seen it in a long time. And it's also clear that much of the code had not been touched in all that time. Very old. And then, of course, a key constraint for us was a very tight budget constraint. So unfortunately, we weren't going to be allowed to do maybe all of the things that we wanted to do because we had to work with the customer to stick within, say, their tight budget. So some of the problems that we came across when we first got our hands on the system were that it had a traditional 3-environment model: development, test, and production. But what became clear to us very quickly was that the test environment didn't work, and clearly been that way for many years. So that was one thing for us to scratch our heads about as we started. The solutions built includes a system of record database. And in there are about 130 tables, 8 gigabytes of data. But the thing that was important to us, that when we looked and compared the database in development and the database in production, no point comparing test because it's not there, there were big differences between the database. And that was obviously an area of concern. Roughly 60 of the 130 tables had a different structure. And there was no real way to tell whether what was in production was correct, or whether we should take what was in development as a reference point. What we inferred from that was almost certainly the previous supplier had been doing changes directly in development. So things were not being developed in in development, and then being rolled into production. They were just making the changes directly in production. What also became clear was that because the company had been through quite a bit of merger and acquisition activity over recent years, that this solution seemed to have dropped down the back of the sofa. IT seemed to be unaware of its existence. When we asked questions about backups and monitoring, they didn't really seem to know that this solution existed. They barely seemed to know that the servers existed and that they were responsible for maintaining them. So, because the people that we were dealing with were very much business-centric, and that the previous people that they had supporting the solution were engaged by the business, then quite clearly that this is shadow IT. IT didn't know what was there, and the business had been managing it directly. We also found, as you would expect, because the solution had been developed many years ago, that quite a lot of the functionality is now deprecated. Still functional. I'm pleased to say IBM are very good at not breaking existing interfaces, but you know, we needed to modernize the application. And the last point was that the underlying platform is already out of manufacturer support. So quite a lot of issues that we needed to address, and you know, plenty for us to do. The one upside amongst all that doom and gloom, the one upside was that the organization clearly had a very, very strong DevOps culture. It's just that because it was the business that were directly managing their solution, they'd no real way to tap into that. You know, they just saw the DevOps team as a bunch of techies, and they'd no common language really that they could use. And that's really, of all the things maybe that BP3 could bring to this this customer, was the thing that we could really focus on, is helping them to get together between the business and the DevOps team. I'm not going to read out this list because there are really it's a sort of recap on the things that that I've already talked about. But there were plenty of things for us to do, you know, and just if I just take two or three off the top, you know, reinstating the test environment was absolutely fundamental. You know, we needed to put that back into place, and we needed to retrain the business into a culture where we would make changes in development, we would deliver them through to test, they would come into the test environment to test them, and only when we got their approval that those things were actually solving the problem that they raised, will we then push them into production. And to us, this is absolutely vital. It fixes so many problems related to doing software development. You know, it means that in effect, we cut down the number of releases that we make, because we're not fixing bugs that get found in production, because you know they've been tested and identified earlier in the life cycle. So I say I'm not reading through the list, but you can see there are many things there, and you know, quite a big challenge in any case. But so we were working under a tight budget, so doubly difficult. So we went through that list and we tried to break it down into, you know, areas of priority, really, just understanding what we need to first. So first of all, we had to understand, you know, the BPM platform. It's undergone several revisions since the version that they have, particularly around the UI. So whilst the UI that they've currently got is actually pretty poor, looks old-fashioned, and whilst we could have updated that, the problem that we would have had is that if we'd updated it to the version that they're running today, when we later come to upgrade the platform, we'd have to do all that work all over again to upgrade to the latest UI. So we made the decision that we would defer all work in that space until we get onto a supported platform. Second was, you know, realigning the development and prod databases. As developers, that's really important to us to give us more stability in making changes and releasing those changes. The downside is that for the business users, it's difficult for them to understand that as a tangible benefit. At the end of the day, they're only really interested in, does the production environment work? So, excuse me. So clearly that was important, so we decided that we would iterate in terms of fixing the database. We could just about get away with what we started with, and then we would work to improve that situation in the background. And then the third pillar was to implement a DevOps pipeline to include automated testing and automated deployment. Again, a little bit hard for the business users to see the benefits of that. But when we back that up with the new software development process, so that we are deploying into a test environment where they can test, then they start to see the benefits. And as we cut down the number of releases and they get more stability in production, that's much easier for them to understand. And so that's where we decided to start. So a little bit about reinstating the test environment. Again, as I said, it's really, as much as anything, it's about implementing a good software development process and retraining the business that they need to come and make comments on what was in the test environment before we would release them to production. It was fairly straightforward. We just took a copy of the production databases to put into the test environment, made sure that the software, the platform itself was functional, and then we were able to bring that online fairly quickly. I think whilst I'm talking about this slide, Debbie wanted to run a quick survey in the background, so maybe he'll post that up. But what did we want to do about modernizing? From a developer point of view, we wanted to get everything under source control. So, whether that was the code itself that the solution was based on, or the configuration around the different environments and automated deployments, automated testing, having everything in source control is absolutely crucial to the way that we want to work. And the second part of that is that, a modern development environment is, the intention is that the developer has all of the tools on their local machine so that they can make changes and test them without having to go to a shared environment and maybe get in the way of other people. So as well as putting all the source code into source control, we wanted to make sure that developers were able to access that locally and make changes and run tests locally as well. As you can see, the customer already had GitLab, which is great. That's what BP3 uses internally as well. Despite that, they were still using Jenkins for their build pipelines, so it's a little bit of a split environment, but that's fine. We can work with that too. And I said the DevOps culture was very strong, so it meant they had good capabilities in terms of container registries, package registries that we could leverage very quickly. They were very well versed in Docker, and so we were able to bring those things online quickly. When we asked about doing data migrations, which we tend to use the Java Flyway library for, they knew all about that. So they were very helpful and able to get us set up on that quickly. Again, when we wanted to use Maven as the build engine, they knew all about Maven. They were able to get us up and running very quickly. So
we'll go ahead and share the results of the poll.
Yeah.
Overwhelming majority of people, of course, are using APIs. I'm actually surprised here that we see a lot of containerization, microservices, people with CI/CD pipelines, which I know that you're an advocate for, and we've talked before about that. So I like the mix going on.
Yeah. So as I said, we used Docker extensively, and the way that we did that was we took copies of the development and production databases, which I said were different. A key part of what we wanted to do was make sure that any changes that we made would be effective on both environments until we could get them up to the same thing. So we took copies of the databases for development and production, put them into Docker containers, and then gave the developers access to both of those environments. What that meant was that they could develop a change locally, test it against a Docker copy of development, then test it locally against a Docker copy of production, and so be absolutely sure that that would work in all environments before we even deployed it to the shared development environment, and then promoted it through the test and production. It also meant that we could develop automated tests locally before we needed to deploy those out to shared environments as well. So, sorry, just lost focus. There we go. So our DevOps pipeline in the end looked like this. If you can see that. So the first stage in the pipeline was to deploy all the changes against a Docker copy of the development database, and then run the test to confirm that was okay. Then we went through exactly the same process again, but this time we substituted the development Docker container for the production Docker container and validate all the tests again. So those things are all happening without touching any of the shared environments. And then the final three stages deploy to development, test, and production in turn. And that's proved to be very successful. You know, again, because the DevOps team to the customer was so strong, then they were able to support us throughout that process, help us to navigate through the various you know, bits of infrastructure that we needed around Docker and Jenkins and registries and whatever other bits and pieces. Of course, something that we were able to do because we had the right vocabulary to talk to them, whereas the business users had no vocabulary in common at all with the DevOps team. So where have we got to? So once we had automated testing in place, yes, we were very quickly able to identify the discrepancies in the table structures and reference data. That was where our initial focus was. And you know, once we understood what those differences were, we were then able to rectify those in an iterative fashion. So we didn't try and fix them all at once at the beginning. As you know, change requests came in from the customer to make changes, then we would try and target the changes that we made to the database schema or indeed the reference data, try and target them to happen at the same time as other changes that we were making. We still haven't really got to the point of tackling the fact that there's 8 gigabytes of data in this database, much of it dating back many years. That's still a conversation we need to have with the customer, but it's on our list of things to address, and hopefully we'll get there soon. So what are our conclusions? What are our takeaways from this project? I think it is fair to say that much of what we've done up until today has been below the waterline as far as the customer is concerned. You know, quite a lot of procedural things, quite a lot of infrastructure things, whether that's real systems infrastructure or whether it's you know, automation infrastructure around a DevOps pipeline. But they have seen the benefits of that because what they've seen is a much more stable production environment, less change, less rework, and you know, whilst those things never registered highly, they are tangible, and they have seen them. I think they've had more involvement with the process because we're asking them to get involved in testing ahead of production deployment, and I think that's led to you know, better engagement with the business. There are, now that we've got some of the basic issues resolved, we're now moving on to tackle more advanced things. So we're right in the middle of doing Active Directory integration for them at the minute, and then once that's out of the way, we'll move on and get the platform upgraded to a current version and get them back into support, and then we can start to tackle the bigger things that we deferred earlier on. So, you know, addressing the UI and getting them something modern and that looks much better. So that's me. Thank you very much for listening. I think we're time to hand over to the next speaker. So I'll take you back to David.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Really appreciate that. You know, it's exciting to me to see how, as somebody that's been working with IBM BPM and Lombardi TeamWorks before that, gosh, it's been 17 years now, I think. You know, it's exciting to see finally us getting into the point where we're doing CI/CD across these kind of BPM applications and doing automated testing. These are really challenging early on, but the way that, you know, the software tools have developed and the way we've started thinking about DevOps and being able to apply that to BPM, I think it's just a great improvement for that environment.
I think what was really compelling there is how, and I think Scott Francis pointed it out on the Slack channel, or on the Slack organization for Driven, was that Joe was able to work through the politics and the finances, and pulling those two things together was really key to the success of this project. So good job, Joe and team.